So hi everyone, my name's Philip Gum from the University of York. Beaker asked me to present something on government surveillance and cryptography with a slightly more sort of technical um, element to it. But what I've actually decided to do is talk really about some of the more historical context with some of the technical detail of the relationship between sort of mass surveillance, the weakening of encryption by governments. And I think this is interesting because it sets into some context some of the Snowden leaks and why they're quite significant for the laws and changes that are being made, and particularly in Britain, but quite a lot in America and all over the world, really. So in the 1970s, the US government started trying to restrict and interfere with the development of use of encryption. And this is commonly referred to as the sort of first encryption war, really. And during this time, strong encryption software and the algorithms were classified as a munition. So they were actually considered as a sort of a weapon and restricted in similar ways. So the export of encryption software was restricted, and the US government also actually did interfere with university research. And interestingly, the Clinton administration in the 1990s tried to enforce the use of this thing called the Clipper chip. So this was a sort of government authorized encryption chip that also had a backdoor which allowed the government to decrypt anything that was encrypted using it. So this is what the Clipper chip looked like, and it would actually be physically put into things like mobile phones and other technology that used encryption. And of course this led to this notion of Big Brother inside. And if you're familiar with the Intel logo, then you can see this as a kind of a riff on that. Of course, with pretty much all weakened encryption, the Clipper chip was a failure. It was cracked. So the government in the US then tried to enforce this system known as a key escrow. And what that meant was that encryption keys used in software would have to be logged with a trusted third party. And then that third party would hand over the keys to law enforcement if requested. And at the same time, the US government cracked down on software that didn't log its keys with the escrow. And there was quite a famous case when the US government tried to prosecute Phil Zimmermann, who was the developer of PGP, which is Pretty Good Privacy, which was a free mass market encryption tool. And they did that because someone exported his software from the US without government permission. Now, Phil Zimmermann was saved from prosecution by code being declared as speech in the US, and therefore was then protected into the US Constitution. So that's quite an interesting story, but we can't really go into it now. And that was done along with an organisation called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So there were similar things happening in the UK during this time, and in the dying days of John Major's Conservative government, they were proposing similar draconian controls. Any provider of encryption services would have to be licensed, and encryption keys would be placed in an escrow to allow the government to read encrypted communications. Now, while in opposition, the British Labour Party were against encryption controls. However, in 1997, once they got into power, they changed their policy. Now, of course, most people will not be surprised about a government changing its policy the minute that they're in power. So it was commonly believed, actually, that the sort of cryptographers and these things called cypherpunks sort of won the first crypto war. And this was partly because cryptography was widely recognised as being essential for sort of e-commerce, e-banking, and pretty much e-everything, really. If you wanted to secure any kind of electronic communication, and encryption was the way to do it. And obviously then it was a facilitator for banking, and obviously the bank's quite a strong lobby. And in 1998, the Foundation for Information Policy Research, which was a group of cryptographers, lawyers, civil liberty groups, they led a successful campaign for digital freedoms. And the whole thing kind of wound up really in the US when Al Gore failed to be elected into the White House, because he was surprisingly a sort of strong proponent of controls on encryption. Something similar happened in the UK. So in 1999, the Blair government conceded that controls on encryption would essentially be counterproductive. MI5 and GCHQ were sort of quite nervous about that, because they obviously thought that it would limit their ability to intercept communications. And in the May 2000 Electronic Communications Act, the Home Office left in the ability for them to create a registration regime for encryption services, something like a key escrow, essentially. That power was subject to a sunset clause, and that sunset clause ran out in 2005. And that really brought to the end to the sort of first crypto war, essentially. But this should all be sounding really very familiar, because we're going through a process today that is very similar. So just sort of to back up a little bit, the restrictions to encryption in the 1990s banned encryption keys of length greater than 40 bits. So essentially encryption works by the longer your key, the better the encryption is and the harder it is to break. And 40 bits isn't very long, and it's thought that this was probably, the restriction was in place probably because the NSA was able to break encryption of 40 bits or less. And I don't know if any of you remember Netscape Navigator, you may be too young, but the international version of Netscape Navigator was limited to keys of 40 bits. But once the restrictions were lifted in the 2000s, the world's internet essentially settled on keys of length of 1024 bits. Now remember that, so that's important for a bit later on. But that is unless you're an Apple device. Apple tends to use a key length of 768 bits, which is a bit of a fail on Apple's part, because that's actually much easier to break. So how we lost the war. So looking back now, it looks quite naive really to say that any kind of war was won. And now we live in a time where governments have unprecedented access to private information, or they're placing laws to give them even more access. Mass surveillance gathers things like text messages, phone calls, internet messaging, email, web history, etc., etc. And they can record you with your phone and track where you've been. So if you've followed any of the news stories on this topic, you'll be aware of most of this, and it'll be covered in the Snowden film. Now, the only thing that can really protect you from this level of surveillance is strong encryption. That's the only way you can anonymize your communications. So we are now in what people are starting to refer to as the second encryption war, second crypto war. So governments are only too aware that encryption is what stands between them and access to all communications. Now, obviously, they at least say that they're doing this for legitimate national security concerns, and there probably are reasonable, there probably are some good reasons where some situations that governments certainly should be able to intercept communications, etc. But it's this sort of mass communications interception that people are a bit worried about, for good reason, I think. But anyway, because of they're essentially trying to regain the ability to read all communications, this idea of weakening encryption is back on the agenda. And there's a quote from David Cameron: "The question remains, are we going to allow a means of communications where it's simply not possible to do that?" My answer to that question is no, we must not. So he's basically saying that there shouldn't be a form of communication that the government cannot read. Even if you don't particularly care about the government reading your communications, I personally think you should, but some people don't, you should care about weak encryption, because a weakness in encryption is not only exploitable by governments, even for legitimate security concerns, it could be exploited by criminals or hostile foreign powers, for example. Now, this is important because the Snowden leaks have possibly put weakening encryption back on the agenda more, or at least sooner than people perhaps thought they would. So Home Secretary Theresa May is not a fan of encryption because she is more of a fan of mass surveillance, and you can see that in the laws that are trying to be passed by Parliament over the last year and into the future. So it started with the Data Retention Investigatory Powers Act in 2014, and that's going to be replaced by the Investigatory Powers Bill this year, which is the one that's known as the Snoopers Charter. Now, within the Investigatory Powers Bill, there are elements, it's quite vaguely written, in fact most of it's quite vaguely written, but there are elements that could signal the end of strong encryption in the UK. So in the section titled Maintenance of Technical Capability, allows the Secretary of State to issue orders to companies relating to the removal of electronic protection applied to any communications data. So that's retrospective removal of encryption. So the only way you can really do that is if you've implemented some kind of weakness, a backdoor. So why is it all back on the political agenda? So the Snowden leaks, some of which you'll see in the film, essentially hint that the NSA was rather pleased with themselves about something a few years ago. And it's thought, although we don't have direct evidence for this, that the NSA have the capacity to break 1024-bit encryption keys. So remember, that's the encryption used for most of electronic communication over the internet, including things like virtual private networks, remote secure shell logins, that kind of thing. So it's a large proportion of the communication done over the internet. And the reason they can do that is that there's a slight weakness in the algorithms used for significant amounts of encrypted communication. And it allows the NSA to pre-calculate some of the encryption key, so that reduces the search space that they have. But they still need really large computers. This is not something you could do with a home computer. You need a really, really big computer. So the problem is now, thanks to Edward Snowden, everybody knows that the NSA is able to break this encryption. Now, you can get around this quite simply. So by changing the encryption algorithm used that doesn't have that pre-calculation vulnerability, or by increasing the key length to something like 2048 bits, that would mean that the NSA and GCHQ would lose their ability to decrypt communication. And we know about this because of Snowden, and therefore it's reasonably likely that the reason that the governments are now so interested in weakening encryption and encryption backdoors are back on the political agenda is because of what Snowden has sort of allowed us to understand. And it's reasonable to say that this only weakens encryption for law-abiding citizens. So terrorists and criminals are unlikely to communicate using government-sanctioned weakened encryption algorithms. And we've already seen examples of organizations like self-named ISIS. They've developed their own secure messaging app. Now, fortunately, that's probably not open source, so it may well have vulnerabilities. But you can see that organizations like that and other criminal organizations aren't going to use government-sanctioned encryption. So it's mainly going to be law-abiding citizens that are affected by weakened encryption. So I leave you with a quote, because I really do think you should care about the government reading your communications. And this quote is from Snowden. It's slightly paraphrased. Saying you do not care about privacy because you have nothing to hide is like saying you do not care about freedom of speech because you have nothing to say. And I think that's a really powerful way of summing up this whole debate. And perhaps if you have time, Mika will play you a video by Juice Media that is sort of covers some of this stuff, and it's really good fun. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, you can always tweet them to me. Some references at the end, and I hope you enjoy the film.